Sugar beet is a $3 billion crop in the USA, and genetically modified herbicide-tolerant beet is of such value to the industry for the improved weed control it offers that in the space of a few years, virtually all beets grown in the USA have become biotech varieties. Moreover, a study in the United Kingdom indicated that biotech varieties could offer substantial environmental benefits compared to conventionally grown varieties. Yet, because of the impacts on small organic growers in the Willamette Valley, where beet seeds are produced, a federal judge's ruling has now made it illegal to plant any of them. So what is going on? What has led to this surprising outcome, and what are its broader consequences? As I began to look for a speaker for this lecture series who understood and could explain the situation clearly and accurately, I found no one who fully understood it and could communicate it publicly. The lack of qualified and able public speakers on this issue was underlined for me when I am not a sugar beet expert, when I was identified by Oregon Public Broadcasting in their Think Out Loud program and was coaxed into taking part, despite a great deal of resistance on my part, into going on the air to discuss it as an expert. When I was on that program, another so-called expert was a journalist from California who could not answer many of the basic questions about sugar beet asked by moderator Emily Harris. But that was the best she could get. So, getting a bit exasperated, I continued to look for potential speakers when I stumbled upon an article in a scientific journal with the name Sweet and Sour, a scientific and legal look at herbicide-tolerant sugar beet. It was authored by our speaker and two faculty members from the University of Minnesota. The article provided a beautifully organized overview of the biological and legal issues and proposed what appeared to be eminently sensible legal remedies that were not being exercised. When I called up one of the authors of the article, a colleague, a scientist colleague I had known over the years, about him possibly giving a lecture at OSU, I was informed that he was not the real expert. It was a graduate student, our speaker tonight. But I also learned talking to him that this was an unusual and outstanding graduate student. Esther McGinnis graduated summa cum laude from Concordia College in 1993, where she majored in philosophy and minored in political science. She then earned her JD in law from the University of Minnesota in 1996 and practiced trial law in Minnesota for 10 years, working in diverse areas, including real estate, contract, and environmental areas. She also published a number of winning cases during her time there. But frustrated by the acrimony of law, including a growing number of divorce and foreclosure cases, and motivated by her strong passion for plants, she returned to graduate school and is now working on a PhD in plant science, which she hopes to earn in June of this year, June of 2011. Since beginning in graduate school, she has made numerous presentations at scientific conferences, independently taught a number of classes, obtained several graduate scholarship awards, and was recognized as an interdisciplinary fellow with a consortium on law and values at the University of Minnesota. I also understand that she plays a mean flute, having been the principal flute in the Concordia College Orchestra. Esther McGinnis, with her advanced training in plant science and real-world experience in law, will help us to understand the strange case of biotech sugar beet and why biotechnology and law just seem to have a hard time getting along. Please help me in welcoming Esther McGinnis to Oregon State. That's your notes.
Thank you for that overly kind introduction. I have to admit I'm already a little bit embarrassed. But I'm very happy to be here in Oregon to discuss this. So we're going to be discussing biotech crops in Oregon, and in particular sugar beets. Now, my name is Esther, and I'm a plant addict. And my plant addiction was so severe, I had to quit the practice of law and go back to school to go study plants. Now, I swore I would never engage in further legal endeavors, but I'm finding I keep getting sucked back in. And that's because we have so few people that can understand the intersection of law, science, and policy. So I'm working in this small little area right there. Now, this is a really fertile area of study, and that's because science is complicated and it's rarely certain. Now, we wish that we could say that science and its related technologies, that we could eliminate all possible risks, but we can't. So it is uncertain. And as a result, we have to have regulatory agencies, and they need to set policies regarding risks associated with science and technologies. They need to identify those risks and communicate the risk. So these are the policy makers. Now, frequently, these regulatory agencies are ineffective. And when they're ineffective, they get sued. It's just a fact of life. So we have the legal system as the third area here. And it has a very uneasy relationship with science and regulatory agencies. And it's no wonder. We have judges deciding these cases, and a lot of them have absolutely no science background. They may have taken one class in college, one scientific class, and probably no statistics classes. Yet they're called upon to make major scientific decisions. Now, we're here today to study the case of Center for Food Safety versus Vilsack. Now, this is the war that I referenced in the title. So this is the conflict, and it originated here in the Willamette Valley. So this is a case involving the right to grow Roundup Ready sugarbeet. And this is a genetically modified crop. It has been modified to be resistant to the herbicide Roundup, or otherwise known as glyphosate. And since it's resistant, you can spray Roundup right over the crop. It will not hurt the crop, but it will kill the weeds that are interspersed with that crop. Now, in this case, I'm going to be discussing the science behind sugar beets, and I'm going to be interspersing that with talk about the regulatory agency and the actual litigation. Now, the science in this case is very interesting because sugar beets have an unusual life cycle. It's not like corn and other agronomic crops, and it also has a unique geographic distribution. Now we're going to be focusing on one regulatory agency, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, otherwise known as APHIS. And this is a division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And in this case, they are being challenged on their effectiveness in regulating this genetically modified crop. Now, of course, the legal system is involved. We have the attorneys, and we also have the court. In this case, the court is being heard in the Federal District Court in the Northern District of California. And that's a little bit unusual because there are no sugar beets grown in the Northern District of California. That's San Francisco. But c'est la vie. So this lawsuit, in a nutshell, is whether any gene flow is permitted from a genetically modified crop to any other crop, namely an organic crop, because it eliminates the farmer's choice to grow a purely non-genetically modified crop. So when I'm talking about gene flow, in this case, I'm going to be talking about the potential for cross-pollination between crops. Now, this case is not just about sugar beets. It would be so simple if it were, but that's not the case. There are 3 crops that are the subject of this lawsuit. We have sugar beets here, kind of this ugly root over here. We have Swiss chard in the middle, and then we have table beet on the right. So what do these 3 crops have in common? They're the same species. Although they look different, they are the same species, Beta vulgaris. They're just different varieties of that species, though. So if you hearken back to your Biology 101, you'll recall what the definition of a species is. It's a taxonomic group that is capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So these are sexually compatible crops. They can interbreed. Of course, you can end up with an intermediate phenotype. But there's something else these 3 crops have in common. They're grown right here in the Willamette Valley. So we have genetically modified sugar beets here. Now these crops are grown organically or conventionally. So anytime that you have these grown in close proximity, there is the potential for cross-pollination between a genetically modified crop and an organic crop. And that is the crux of this case. Now I need to mention that there is no organic sugar beet crop that is grown, or if it's grown on such a small scale that it hasn't registered. Now let's talk about these crops. The sugar beet crop, I'm going to call it the Rodney Dangerfield of crops. And it really gets no respect. And part of it is because it's so ugly. It's just this ugly root. But I would bet that if you know more about it, you would love it if you have a sweet tooth. So sugar beets are 16 to 22% sucrose. So in other words, we get our table sugar from them. So I have to admit I'm a sugar addict too, as well as being a plant addict, and that's not a good thing. So almost 60% of our domestically produced table sugar came from sugar beet in 2010. The remaining 40% came from domestically produced sugar cane. Sugar beets are produced in 10 or 11 states, depending upon the year. And I'll show you a map soon of where they're grown. Now, even though we produce a fair amount of sugar, we don't produce enough. We still have to import some sugar from foreign countries. So why do we want a Roundup Ready sugar beet? Why isn't the conventional crop good enough for us? Well, it stems from the crop itself. Weed control is consistently the #1 problem in sugar beet crops. And this is because sugar beet is a very slow grower. It's a very poor competitor with weeds. And that's because it grows so slowly, it takes 2 months before the plants close the canopy and shade the ground. So 2 months for them to fill in. And during that time, weeds can certainly get a hold on the crop and decimate the crop. So we do have conventional herbicides, but unfortunately, they provide mediocre control. These herbicides are quite old, and there's been no new technology invested into finding better herbicides for the sugar beet crop. So as a result, they have to spray 3 or 4 times during the course of the growing season. But even that is not enough. They end up having to cultivate at least once or twice per summer to kill some weeds that were not controlled by the conventional herbicide. Now, in contrast, in looking at a 2008 survey of farmers from North Dakota and Minnesota, we found that Roundup Ready sugar beet provides the best weed control they have ever had. And they can do so without doing so many cultivations. In addition, they're getting higher yields. Not higher yields from the Roundup Ready gene. They're getting higher yields because there isn't so much weed pressure. So farmers are loving this. It's also less costly to produce. If you don't have to apply herbicide as often, if you don't have to get into the field as often, you're going to be saving money. So it's no wonder that from 2007 to 2010, 95% of the industry adopted the Roundup Ready sugar beet technology. Now I'm just going to say a little bit about geographic distribution. Now don't worry about the legend down here, but if you look at the shaded boxes here that are in green, yellow, and cream, this is where sugar beets are grown. And this is the root production crop that is in these colors. Now the sugar beet seed production crop is grown separately here in the Willamette Valley. Now the Swiss chard and table beet seed crops are also produced in the Willamette Valley, but they tend to be at the margins of the valley and at the northern end. Now these are organic and conventional crops, and as a result, there's little tolerance by the organic market for contamination or cross-pollination from genetically modified crops or the Roundup Ready sugar beet. Now Roundup Ready has had quite the regulatory journey. It has had to obtain approval from 3 separate agencies. There's the Food and Drug Administration. It is responsible for the food safety aspect of Biotech Crops. So it has determined that the sugar that comes from sugar beets is in fact safe. It's identical to the sugar that you would get from conventional sugar beets. Then we have the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're responsible for regulating the application of herbicide or Roundup over the crop and how much residue can be left on that crop. Now we're going to focus on the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS. They are important because they regulate the importation, transportation, and release of genetically modified crops. So they oversee field trials and deregulation. So deregulation is when the crop can be grown as a commercial crop. It can be grown like any other agronomic crop. Now I'm going to make you learn a little bit of law, but I've only got one slide that's going to be statutory. But this is going to be important for the rest of the lecture, and that's because the lawsuit is based on this statute. So this is the National Environmental Policy Act. It's been around since the Nixon administration. Now, all federal agencies must analyze the environmental impact of major federal actions. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat that deregulating a genetically modified crop is, in fact, a major federal action. So the question becomes, how far does a regulatory agency like APHIS need to go in evaluating the environmental risks before it deregulates a genetically modified crop? So it has two routes that it can go. The first one is it can prepare an environmental assessment. And the environmental assessment is really a concise evaluation. It takes about a year to prepare, and they're typically about 25 to 50 pages long. Now, this is the easier route to go. Now, if they do find, after preparing the environmental assessment, that in fact there is a risk of environmental harm, then they must go forward and prepare this environmental impact statement. This is the more burdensome of the two processes. Now, I was just reading an environmental impact statement for Roundup Ready alfalfa, and it came in at was it 1,200 or 1,400 pages long. And so that includes all the appendices. So not exactly light reading. So in addition to being lengthy, it can take many years to prepare and cost well over $1 million. So you understand, regulatory agencies really would rather just go with the environmental assessment. It's far cheaper and is less time consuming. But the question as to which one you prepare depends on if GMO deregulation is significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. So Roundup Ready's Sugarbeet regulatory journey started in March of 2005 with APHIS. So APHIS deregulated the sugarbeet crop without any restrictions. Now, this particular document was very, very concise. I'm being generous when I'm saying that it came in at 24 pages. So that includes probably about 3 pages worth of citations. So a very concise document. Now, do you think it addressed the issue of cross-pollination with domestic crops such as Swiss chard and table beets? Oh, we've got some smart people here tonight. There was absolutely no mention of Swiss chard or table beet seed crops. No mention at all. There was one little sentence that hinted that Oregon State University seed certification standards would protect against gene flow. But no mention of Swiss chard or table beet in this environmental assessment. So they issued a finding of no significant environmental impact, and that was not the end of the story. So remember I told you that agencies that are ineffective in regulating are going to get sued. And that's what happened here. So this lawsuit was filed in 2008 under the National Environmental Policy Act. And we have many plaintiffs in this case. But I need to explain the convention for naming of cases. So this is the primary plaintiff in the case, Center for Food Safety. And any time you sue a regulatory agency like APHIS, you have to sue the USDA and the Secretary of Agriculture. So that's why the last name on this is Vilsack. So the poor guy gets sued every time every time that there's a lawsuit against the USDA. But fortunately, it's not in his personal capacity. So we have a lot of plaintiffs in this lawsuit. Center for Food Safety, we've got Earth Justice, Sierra Club, High Mowing Organic Seeds, and the Organic Seed Alliance. Now, poor Frank, I've circled his name because he is really the impetus behind this suit. He is the one who was growing organic Swiss chard in table beets and was concerned about the potential for gene flow. And he's also a member of Center for Food Safety. And potentially he may be one of your neighbors. And then, of course, I mentioned the defendant. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Center for Food Safety, the lead plaintiff in this case. It's an organic advocacy group, and it's generally against genetically modified crops, particularly when they come in conflict with organic crops. Now, I wish I could tell you who's on the board of advisors for this year, but I was unable to obtain this list. So this list is a year or two old. So we've got Margaret Mellon from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Then we've got some celebrity chefs. We've got Rick Moonen from Mandalay Bay. I think he's got a seafood restaurant there. We've got Alice Waters, a celebrity chef. And for good measure, they've got Abby Rockefeller. And then, of course, they've got a fair number of faculty from various universities, usually from their ecology departments. And then we have their sister organization, International Center for Technology Assessment. Now, these two organizations are run by Andrew Kimbrell, and he is a protege of Jeremy Rifkin. So I think it's safe to say that he is somewhat suspicious of technology. So I have to really admire Center for Food Safety because their legal strategy has been impeccable. It's a very small organization, fewer than 20 employees, and they've been filing one case after another and having this cumulative effect. And they're really setting precedent throughout the country. So it's really quite a coup for them as such a small organization to have such a huge impact on the country. Now you may ask, how are they financed? I don't really have access to their finance sheets, but they are partially financed by the litigation itself. Every time they win a case under the National Environmental Policy Act, then the losing party, which in this case is usually APHIS, has to pay their attorney's fees. So I mean, they could win anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million in each case, and which helps finance their battles. So let's go to round one of Center for Food Safety versus Vilsack. Now this took place over the course of 2.5 years and really was decided on summary judgment motions. It didn't go to trial. It was heard by the Northern District of California. The court ruled that APHIS should have been more thorough in evaluating environmental risks. Was this a surprise? Not really. I mean, they didn't address the issue of pollen flow to organic Swiss chard and table beets. So they should have prepared an environmental impact statement and going further in their evaluation. So the court then stopped Roundup Ready Sugarbeet seed and root production while the environmental impact statement is being prepared. Now you may ask, what is the difference between seed and root production? And my answer is a lot. And in order to understand the difference, you need to know the unique reproductive biology of sugar beets. So sugar beets are not like corn and other annual crops. This is a biennial life cycle. It takes 2 years for it to complete its life cycle. In the first year, it grows its foliage. It forms that basal rosette and a fleshy root. The fleshy root is what is accumulating the sucrose. And it does this in the first year. Now, if it survives winter, and it won't survive winter in cold climates, it will flower that second year. It'll use the sucrose to send up a 6-foot tall flowering stalk and then flower and set seed. So now that you understand the biology, you can understand the difference between root production and seed production. So the goal for root production is you want to grow and harvest roots for their sugar. So you plant the seeds in the spring, You let them grow throughout the summer. The root is accumulating sucrose. And then you harvest the root in the first year. So what's interesting about root production is that it doesn't flower. And you don't want this plant to flower. If it flowers, it's going to deprive that root of sucrose, and that root is going to not have any value. And for the most part, this crop has been bred not to prematurely bloom. Now, there's very little risk of gene flow in root production. So the plant is harvested before it flowers. Now, occasionally you may get one plant that flowers, and it's usually 1/10% or less than that flowers. But it's usually a very isolated instance. And since it's growing to the height of 5 or 6 feet tall, the farmer has every incentive to remove that beet before it sets seed. And he can find it easily and remove it, because otherwise it would interfere with harvest. Now, there's also the potential that as you are trucking your sugar beets to market, that you may have some that fall in the ditch. So what happens to those? Well, keep in mind, this is a Mediterranean crop. The center of origin is the Mediterranean. So if you're growing this in North Dakota or North Dakota or Minnesota, you get winter temperatures that dip down to at least 20 below zero every winter. So these beets generally do not persist in the environment. Now, occasionally you may have snow acting as an insulator where you have an isolated beet that does survive, but it's not going to persist long in the environment. These are self-incompatible plants. So, in summary, very little risk of gene flow in root production. Furthermore, root production is isolated from areas that produce Swiss chard seed or table beet seed. So remember, Swiss chard seed is grown along the coast here. So we have that geographic separation between the sugar beet root production and potentially sexually compatible crops. Now, sugar beet seed production is a whole different animal. You have a different goal. You want to make this plant flower so it produces seeds. Now, this is almost exclusively done in the Willamette Valley. Now, there's probably a small pocket in Arizona, but for the most part, the Willamette Valley is what is important to sugar beet seed production. Now, sugar beet seeds are grown on limited acreage, 3,000 to 5,000 acres, and it's been grown here in the valley since World War II. Now, in order to get it to flower, you need to have essentially 2 years, or parts of 2 years. So sugar beet seed production is divided into 2 phases. The first phase is the vegetative phase. This is when you grow the root, and they call that a steckling. So you're probably reading about stecklings in the news these days. So in order to grow this root, it's seeded here in the Willamette Valley in late August. The plant goes dormant in November, and then the plant is initiated to flower over the course of the winter, but it doesn't start sending up that seed stalk yet, or the flowering stalk yet. Those roots, or the stecklings, are then harvested in February. They are then moved and transplanted. This is a matter of space. During the vegetative stage, the plants are planted close together. Now, for the reproductive stage, for efficiency purposes, you then transplant the stecklings and give them much more room to grow. And you do it in an organized fashion. You want to plant in blocks with male and female rows. And I'll get to that in my next slide, so hold on to that thought. So now, during the second phase, the plant bolts. It sends up that flowering stalk, it sets seed over the course of the summer, and then is harvested in August. Now, I mentioned that we've got separate male and female plants, and you can kind of see in the difference, there's a little bit difference in color in this slide. So in the center, you have either 6 or 8 rows of female plants for every 2 rows of male plants. So the female plants are male sterile. So that means they're not producing pollen, but that is the plant that is producing the seed. Now, in between, in this lighter green area right here, we have 2 rows of male plants. These are the male fertile pollinator plants. So there's not as much pollen that is released in this crop because only 1/4 of the plants are producing pollen. Now, initially, the Roundup Ready gene was carried in the pollen from these male plants. So going back to the legal case, Judge White identified his environmental concerns. He was concerned about possible gene flow from these male pollinator plants of the sugar beets that were Roundup Ready, and he was afraid of the gene flow to organic or conventional table beet and Swiss chard crops in the Willamette Valley. He was also concerned that organic farmers and consumers would be deprived of the choice to grow and eat organic products. Now, the judge made no findings with regard to root production, but nonetheless, he banned root production. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, but I kind of understand why he did it. And that's because at about the same time that the sugar beet case was being decided, we had a Supreme Court case. And I have to tell you, as an attorney, it was exciting to see an agronomic case being decided by the Supreme Court. So I was waiting with anticipation to see what the Supreme Court was going to do. But I was a little disappointed. The Supreme Court refused to talk about any of the scientific issues. It refused to talk about how the crops were grown. Instead, the case was decided procedurally. So even though this case, which has a different caption and different parties, involved Roundup Ready alfalfa, it's essentially the same case. So APHIS has made this mistake before. So APHIS failed to prepare an environmental impact statement when it was releasing Roundup Ready alfalfa. So the lower court found that there was a violation of NEPA. The question that the Supreme Court was addressing in this case was, what is the proper remedy for a violation under the National Environmental Policy Act? So the court first said that the proper remedy is to void the deregulation. So that returns the crop to regulated status under APHIS. So it can't be grown commercially like other agronomic crops. However, the Supreme Court did throw APHIS a bone. It said that APHIS can undertake temporary measures while it is preparing that environmental impact statement. So it can take temporary measures such as issuing permits for field testing, and it can even go so far as a partial regulation, or a partial deregulation. Now, in my mind, this is somewhat confusing because I think instead of clarifying things, the Supreme Court is going to be causing more litigation. And we're already seeing that in the Willamette Valley. And that's because APHIS now can take temporary measures, but we really don't know how far they can go with the temporary measures. So that's why we need to look to the future, because round 2 of Center for Food Safety versus Vilsack is already occurring and was actually being heard today in the Northern District of California. So as we look at future litigation that's going to come from this case and from future decisions by APHIS, I think we need to go back to the science. We need to understand how the crop is being grown. We need to take an objective look at the risks and see if there's some way that we can protect the organic industry as well as conventional and farmers of genetically modified crops. So as I mentioned, round 2 of Center for Food Safety versus Vilsack has already begun, and you're probably reading about it in the papers. So in this case, we're talking just like a week or two after APHIS lost their case before the Northern District of California, they went ahead and issued a permit. So now they're operating under those temporary measures or those interim measures I told you about. So they issued a permit to 3 or 4 seed companies to grow Roundup Ready Sugarbeet stecklings. So if you'll recall, those stecklings, those are the first phase. That's the vegetative phase for seed production. So I mean, just within days of losing that first case, they've gone forward with a permit, and they're already Roundup Ready sugar beets that have been planted in the valley for seed production, but they're not permitted to allow them to flower. And that, I predict, is going to be round 3. So I'm looking in my crystal ball. So I'm thinking there's going to be another permit coming soon, and that will be to allow those stecklings to flower and produce seed. Now, without these permits, there will be no sugar beet seeds for 2012. So what APHIS is trying to accomplish here is to allow seed production so Roundup Ready sugar beet can be produced in 2012, provided that they have prepared the environmental impact statement by then. I also see a fourth piece of litigation that will be coming. APHIS has promised that it will partially deregulate reproduction in major areas, but not in areas close to organic chard or table beet production. So what it would do is a partial deregulation. There would be restrictions such as geographic restrictions and isolation distances, possibly windbreaks and such. Now, as you can imagine, sugar beet farmers are so confused, particularly in my home state of Minnesota, where a lot of the sugar beets are grown. So the root producers don't know what to plant for next year, but they're required by contract to grow sugar beets. And typically, they're buying seed for November and December. They're buying seed now for the following year and making their decisions as to what they're going to grow. But there's uncertainty. They don't know if APHIS is going to be successful in partially deregulating Roundup Ready sugar beet production for 2011 for the root production. And that's because there are shortages. There are shortages of conventional seed, although I've heard there may be some warehouses that would allow, some warehouses that have some old seed in stock. But the greater worry is that they've stopped making the conventional herbicides that can be applied to conventional sugar beet crops. Really, there is no incentive for the manufacturers to produce these conventional herbicides anymore because of this legal uncertainty. So say, for example, APHIS is in fact successful at partially deregulating Roundup Ready sugar beet, then these manufacturers are going to be stuck with these herbicides. So they have no incentive to start producing those herbicides. So any way that they look at it, these sugar beet root producers are stuck. Now, I believe that's unfortunate. I think there is a way that we can grow sugar beet sustainably. And we really need to study the science, like the pollen flow studies. Now, I've read a ton of these pollen flow studies, dating all the way back to the 1930s. And we know how far sugar beet pollen travels. So we've got studies saying that if you fly a plane over a sugar beet seed crop, the pollen will travel to an altitude of 1,500 meters. They've also done studies where they have tracked horizontal flow, so flow across the land to 1,100 meters from the field. And they've got confirmed pollination up to 1,000 meters. But realistically speaking, the potential for cross-pollination, or the potential for pollen flow really drops off after a couple hundred meters. Now I don't doubt that pollen can be carried greater than 1 kilometer. And I'm sure that most people would agree that you would have sufficient winds in the valley to carry it more than 1,000 meters. But you also need to keep in mind that pollen viability is limited. The pollen will be good for 24 hours in good weather. If it starts to rain, that's the end of pollen viability. The fear of cross-pollination also runs both ways. So sugar beet seed producers are afraid that Swiss chard and table beet seed crops will cross-pollinate their crops. Now, that is a powerful incentive for them to adopt some sort of isolation distance. Now, sugar beet seed producers don't want their crops cross-pollinated by these organic Swiss chard or table beet crops because you're going to get this hybrid phenotype. You're going to get something that looks like a cross between the two. So they're not concerned about the organic part. It's about the fact that you would get something that would be half sugar beet and half Swiss chard. Now, that's not going to be valuable to them. Now, it's more likely that Swiss chard and table beet seed crops would pollinate the sugar beet crop, and that's because it's open pollinated. All the plants in a Swiss chard seed crop would produce pollen. That's in contrast to the sugar beet crop. The sugar beet crop, remember, is a hybrid crop. I showed you that picture where we had 6 rows of male sterile female plants. These are the plants that are not producing pollen, but they would be the plants that eventually set seed. And then we've got 2 rows of those pollinator plants. So there's a whole lot less pollen that is being produced by the sugar beet crop in comparison to the Swiss chard and table beet seed crops. Now, cross-pollination can be largely prevented by isolation distances. And there are a lot of isolation distances we can choose from. Oregon State Seed Certification Standards recommends 1.5 miles. We have the Willamette Valley Specialty Seed Association. Now, this is the association, and its membership is all the specialty seed producers in the valley. Now, they have adopted 3 miles as their isolation distance. But the sugar beet seed companies have gone a step further. They want 4 miles as their isolation distance. So they are all growing, they're growing sugar beets, and there's at least 4 miles between sugar beets and organic Swiss chard or table beets. Now, how do they keep track of this? Well, there are maps in 2 of the counties here in the Willamette Valley. So as a farmer, you can go in, look at the map, and you'll see that there are pins that are placed for each farm. So you can see what is being grown on a given acreage. Now, the priority to place those pins is based on seniority and is largely, I believe, regulated by the Specialty Seed Association. So I've said that we can protect against gene flow through isolation distances, but there's an even better way to mitigate gene flow. And that is, new technology has come along since this case first was filed. I told you that initially the Roundup Ready gene was inherited in the pollen, so it came from those 2 rows of pollinator plants. However, now the Roundup Ready gene, or the transgene, is now inherited from the female plant. And remember, that female plant is male sterile. So with this technology, they can use conventional pollinators. So you don't really have pollen that is carrying that Roundup Ready gene. Now, occasionally you may have a female plant that will not be male sterile. There's always that risk of that. But it is a practice of these seed companies to rogue or remove those female plants that are not male sterile because it would actually harm the genetics of the crop. Now, by 2010, 78% of the Roundup Ready sugar beet seed crop had adopted this technology. So they're not producing pollen that has the Roundup Ready trait. So this is going to protect the organic farmers. Now, we've talked about the risk to the organic farmers. I'd like to talk about the risk of growing conventional sugar beet. I find that we frequently forget to ask that question. We forget to ask what are the risks and benefits of both sides. There is a risk to growing conventional sugar beet, particularly in the root-producing areas. So let's look at a conventional sugar beet regimen here. Now, when you are producing conventional sugar beets, remember, you're using this cocktail of herbicides. There are 5 to 7 herbicides that are mixed together, albeit at low rates, but you're using 5 to 7 herbicides. Now, these herbicides are not very effective, so you have to apply it more. So in 2008, the average farmer was applying it between 3 and 4 times during the course of the growing season. So you've got more trips across the field and more herbicide being sprayed. That said, that conventional herbicide still isn't effective. So on average, the farmer has to mechanically cultivate his crop twice during the summer. Now, in comparison, on the other side, you have Roundup. Now, you can grow a Roundup Ready crop just with Roundup. Now, occasionally you may use another form of weed control for other reasons, but for the most part, you can just subsist on Roundup. Now looking at a 2008 survey, farmers in the Red River Valley of North Dakota and Minnesota, on average, only had to apply Roundup twice during the growing season. So, I mean, that's a great benefit to the farmers there. And additionally, they virtually wiped out mechanical cultivation, so weed control was that effective. But as you can see here, on the conventional side, you're having to take your tractor across the field more times. You have to apply more herbicide, you have to cultivate. So as a result, you are using more fuel. Now, this has been documented in Europe. This came from a European study that looked at the environmental effects comparing conventional regimens of growing sugar beet There were a couple, these were from the United Kingdom. This is from Germany. And the HT stands for herbicide tolerant. So this is essentially Roundup on this side. So in this study, they found that Roundup is more sustainable when it comes to energy usage. So less energy is used by the farmer when he grows the crop using Roundup Ready technology as opposed to conventional. Now this is the global warming potential, so the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted. And it's the same story here. Less carbon dioxide is emitted when you grow the crop using Roundup Ready technology as opposed to conventionally. Now if we look at the toxicity between the herbicides, there is a clear difference. The herbicides that are used conventionally are way more toxic. And if you look at the studies, you'll see they're more likely to leach into the water and hurt aquatic organisms. In contrast, Roundup has much lower toxicity. And the same goes for carcinogenicity. So we can see it can be sustainable to grow a Roundup Ready crop. Now, Roundup Ready has also facilitated better farming practices. So I mentioned we've got fewer cultivations and herbicide applications. As a result, there's less soil erosion. And particularly in North Dakota, where we've got the wind blowing, you don't want to disturb the soil too much. In addition, Roundup Ready has enabled farmers to adopt minimum or strip tillage systems. So the farmers do not have to prepare the seed bed before they plant. So they don't have to plow the fields. Instead, they can plant right into the stubble. So this obviously has environmental impacts because you're disturbing the soil less and there's less erosion and more water retention by the soils. I would be remiss if I didn't say there is a risk of increased Roundup use. Now, if you use Roundup, if you use a lot of Roundup, there's a potential to accelerate Roundup-resistant weeds. But to keep this in perspective, sugar beet production only accounts for less than 1% of Roundup use in the US. So the major users are still out there. I mean, it's still being used for soybeans and for corn. So Roundup Ready sugar beet is really just a drop in the bucket. But that said, I think we need to be responsible. We should avoid growing Roundup crops back to back. So we shouldn't be growing Roundup Ready corn, then Roundup Ready sugar beet, then Roundup Ready soybean, and continuing that pattern, because that would accelerate Roundup Ready, the development of Roundup resistant weeds. Now, it wouldn't happen over the course of 3 years, but a decade or more, it certainly would have that risk. So I would encourage that we do need some sort of national dialogue use as to which crops should use Roundup and to avoid that back-to-back rotation. Now, I started this lecture by entitling it "At War over Biotech Crops in Oregon." So my question is there room for a truce? Is there room for coexistence between Roundup Ready sugar beet farmers and organic Swiss chard and table beet farmers? And I would hope that there is. So as we look back, sugar beet production areas, in those areas, there's really very little risk. There's no risk, in fact, to organic Swiss chard and table beet seed producers. And that's because there's that geographic separation between sugar beet root production and organic seed producing areas. So there's no risk from the root production portion of the crop. And furthermore, as we said, sugar beet will not persist in the environment, particularly in those northern states. In the Willamette Valley, yes, there is some risk, but that risk can be minimized. There are relatively few Swiss chard and table beet seed growers in the valley. The majority are in Washington or California, which means we can work with these farmers. We can impose isolation distances and try and protect these farmers. And there's infrastructure in place for coexistence. There's the Willamette Valley Specialty Seed Association. They have the organization to organize this. They have the ability to make sure that isolation distances are being followed. And we can impose good scientifically researched isolation distances between these crops. Now, I don't know the magic number. Is it 3 miles? Is it 4 miles? Is it 5 miles? But I believe there is some number that would be appropriate for minimizing or almost entirely preventing gene flow. And then to top it off, we could require all seed producers of the Roundup Ready seed crop to require the Roundup Ready gene to be inherited maternally. So remember, I told you initially the Roundup Ready gene was inherited through the pollen. Now it's the mother plant that is carrying this. So we're really not having pollen flow anymore. So I believe there is room for coexistence here in the Willamette Valley. Now that said, it's an interesting fact. As I read through all the pleadings in this case, plaintiffs have never detected any GMO contamination in their organic chard or table beet seeds despite multiple years of testing. So I believe that we can find a good solution, and in fact maybe the existing practices are good enough for preventing most contamination. Now in conclusion, I believe we can find a stable peace that can enable coexistence between the farmers. We need to balance the burden between organic, conventional, and GM farmers. Now, at the beginning, we were talking about APHIS, and unfortunately, APHIS placed the entire burden on the organic farmers, and that was not right. But now the burden has been shifted entirely to the farmers of genetically modified crops, and this is not right either. There needs to be a balance of the burden. And the burdens I'm talking about is the burden of gene flow. There's always a little bit of a risk. We can never fully eliminate the risk unless we grew all of our plants in a greenhouse. But that's not what we do. So gene flow will happen, but albeit at really small levels. Now I'm going to state that I believe that a zero tolerance policy is not good for the economy, because we would not then be able to grow any of our genetically modified crops. So I believe that we need to adopt low-level presence standards. It's some sort of threshold. I don't know whether it's like 1 contaminated seed out of 500, 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 10,000. I don't know what the magic number is, but there is already talk across the country of adopting some sort of threshold so that low levels of contamination of organic seed would be acceptable to the markets. Now, GM farmers could then work with this threshold and prevent cross-pollination in excess of a reasonable threshold. And I believe this solution would help preserve coexistence between organic and genetically modified farmers. All right, thank you. Yeah.
So I have a question that's slightly off the main thrust here, so maybe we get it out of the way right now and then get back to other things. So as you know, Roundup resistance depends on an endogenous gene. It's not, a gene from outer space stuck in there. It's possible, and in fact companies are working on this as we speak, to mutate the endogenous genes so as to express the appropriate mutation that makes for Roundup resistance.
Yes.
Therefore, it's never transgenic.
Yes.
Is it your sense that, and I know this is probably a tough haul, but as a lawyer, so to speak, is it your sense that that is just going to be completely beyond this litigation?
Yes, because it is the actual process. I'm sorry. So the question is, if you have an endogenous gene such as Roundup resistance, would that fall within the purview of regulation here? And the answer is no. It all depends on the process. So APHIS is called to regulate genetically modified crops because if you read the statute, it's the process. So if you use agrobacterium as your method for introducing the gene, if you use E. coli as a vector or for multiplication purposes, that's what triggers review. Now, if you're if you're taking an endogenous gene but not transforming the plant, if you are engaging in mutation breeding or radiating seeds to try and get a certain crop, that doesn't fall within it. And you'll see that a lot of the resources have been diverted away from genetic modification to these other technologies because they're not regulated. Good question.
So I have a question. Very good lecture.
Oh, thank you.
But, and I know very little about this subject, so you'll definitely be able to help me here.
Okay.
So we've arrived at this state where we have 95% genetically modified sugar beets. Right? Can you just a brief summary of how we got to this position? I mean, were the regulatory agencies involved early before they were allowed to plant these crops, or how did that all work out?
Well, it was, so you're asking about the regulatory history of this crop and how fast it was adopted. Now, it really did happen very fast. The deregulation decision came down in 2005. The industry geared up very fast, and by, I think, 2008, 60% of the industry had adopted it, and that's when the lawsuit was filed. So the lawsuit wasn't filed until 3 years. So during that course of time, there was a lot of investment in this crop, and the industry had adopted it before this litigation was started. It might have been a different story if the litigation had occurred earlier. But they waited 3 years to file this lawsuit against APHIS, which really allowed this crop to flourish and be widely adopted throughout the country. And it was just that good, everybody wanted it. And there's something I didn't mention. It really is a quality of life issue for farmers in the north. The herbicide application is very touchy because it really depends on a narrow window. This conventional herbicide has got to be sprayed when the weeds are like at the 3 or 4 leaf stage. So, I mean, you've got to get out there. It doesn't matter if it's Sunday morning, you got to get out there when it's the right stage and spray. If you miss that window, the weeds are not going to be controlled. Furthermore, if the temperatures are too warm, you're going to have damage to the actual sugar beet plant itself. So Roundup Ready was adopted so fast because it allows flexibility for the farmer. The farmer doesn't have to be so tied to these narrow windows of application, so the farmer has more time with his family. So I think it was adopted so fast because it improved the quality of life for sugar beet farmers. Okay. Yes?
Can you explain how you see the role of APHIS in this? Because if you look at the coexistence that you say that is possible, then that would require deregulation in part. And that means that APHIS needs to police it, which they don't want to do and open themselves up for more lawsuits. So if you expand that to the alfalfa case, which is similar but more complicated than the sugar beets, how do you look at that?
Well, how do I look at APHIS? So you're asking how I think APHIS should be doing this. Well, I think, first of all, APHIS has to abide by the law. And I believe when it's being overly lax, it is then opening itself to litigation, which hurts the farmers in this case. So what I think they have to do is, I don't think they're going to win with respect to the seed crop, so rounds 2 and 3. What I think they need to focus on is round 4. Now, there really is no environmental or very little environmental risk if they partially deregulate the reproduction crop that takes place in other areas of the country. But what they're going to have to do in order to do this is they're fast going to have to pull together an environmental assessment which carefully delineates what the potential risks are and honestly addresses those issues. I mean, to date, I believe that APHIS has not necessarily done a good job at identifying the risks and addressing them. So the only way this is going to work is if APHIS, in fact, is a better regulator. Yes?
I see a difference between the discussion of risk, which is risk of pollination, which is sort of limited, and the question of harm to the consumer. This is what drives organic eaters. They're worried about the harm to them from consuming something which has been contaminated, and that's my word.
Okay.
Where does the regulation go in regard to differentiating between risk and harm?
And consumer harm? Well, that has already been decided by the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration has determined there is no risk associated with these biotech crops. So they're the ones responsible for regulating that. And I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question there. But you're asking about who regulates it and helps the consumer so they are not harmed by consuming genetically modified gene proteins or transgenes. So in this case, it is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration.
And is that regulation safe? Is it justified? Is it, you know?
Is it?
I'm suspicious.
Okay, okay. You're suspicious. Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Food and Drug Administration, but they were not sued in this matter. They did follow all the proper protocols. Now, in this particular case, there really is no problem with the sugar. So even though it's coming from a Roundup Ready crop, they have determined that it is the same as conventional sugar. So really, there is no risk. Yes.
So I'm kind of wondering if we have this Roundup Ready resistant weeds that are going to start happening. To me, it's sort of similar to people becoming, organisms becoming resistant to penicillin or this other stuff, that maybe what we really should work in the long run is to grow organic and not be trying to use these technology, pharmaceutical, pesticide things. That's what we should go for. And
Now I'm going to try and summarize what you just said. So you're comparing Roundup resistance to the resistance that we're seeing to antibiotics. And I think that is a fair analogy. But you are saying that maybe we should just adopt all organic production methods. But I don't think that's really necessary. We can, in fact, prevent resistance to Roundup. We can do that by judicious use of other pesticides, so using other modes of action and not having all these successive rotations. So I believe we can prevent resistance by using good measures, particularly good stewardship measures. Yes.
So, keeping in mind the recent cornering of the market, the herbicide market, by Monsanto with Roundup, Sugarbeet crops, and the subsequent decline in seed production of conventional and organic crops, is it a concern for you that in the midst of a lawsuit like this, when there's an injunction for them not to produce crops, and we're having a lack of conventional and organic seeds, that can become a problem for natural sugarcane production, sugarbeet production? So
are you saying that there is a decline in seed production of organic crops?
Well, you said that there was a shortage coming out of conventional seeds for sugar beets.
Yes, yes. I mean, I guess I'm not quite understanding your question. So
is it a concern that since there's a shortage, I feel like the shortage is, caused by the fact that 95% of the market has been taken over by Roundup Ready sugar beets. So now, in the midst of having this lawsuit, farmers aren't able to grow the Roundup Ready ones, and we have a shortage of seeds. So is that a concern that?
Well, is there a concern regarding the shortage of conventional seeds? Yes, yes. I mean, there simply has not been enough time. There has not been enough time to produce conventional seeds because remember, it takes 2 years to produce those seeds. So this lawsuit was only completed in August of this year. So we're kind of, I shouldn't say we because I'm not part of the sugar beet industry, I'm a horticulturalist, but the sugar beet producers are in a bind because there may be some seed out there, but it's old. It's probably from 2008. There may be enough for the Red River Valley, but I've heard that there probably is going to be shortages for farmers in eastern Oregon and in Idaho. And that's because you need to have specific specific cultivars for your area depending on what sort of diseases that you have for your area. So there just isn't enough seed that would be of the right type for each area. And yes, that is a concern. And I probably should have mentioned that if there is a shortage, it is believed that our sugar production will drop by 20%. And already we've got globally short, our sugar is short globally. So, I mean, you're probably going to see some increases in your food prices, and it's just going to be tighter.
Could that have been prevented if there were more of a balance between conventional and, Roundup Ready sugar beet production?
So you're wondering if there could have been some sort of balance if we had preserved both Roundup Ready and conventional. But it's the market that determined that. Frankly, it was just a better technology for the farmers because of the ease of weed control. So the market really wasn't thinking of that. I think the sugar beet industry thought they were going to win this lawsuit. No, but there's just not enough time to plan.
Imported sugar that you mentioned earlier, is that conventionally grown or is that GMO sugar that we import? I mean, I guess what is our United States growers up against both?
Well, I believe we're importing. I'm not sure which countries are growing it, but it's sugar cane, and it's probably conventional sugar cane. Although I may be wrong about that, but I don't think we're importing.
I think it's conventional.
Yeah, I think it's conventional. I don't think we're getting it from genetically modified sugar cane, but we may lose out to these foreign countries. Yes.
A solution. We just recognize Cuba and quite. That's what we need to do.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Is there a patent on the seed, the genetically modified seed, and who owns it?
Of course, there's a patent on every one of these crops, and yes, it is owned by Monsanto. I don't know if KWS is also involved in it, because KWS was instrumental in developing the Roundup Ready technology in sugar beet. So it may be between the two of them. But I mean, that's true of pretty much any crop out there. It's usually patented.
There is one company that is benefiting from everyone growing this Roundup Ready.
Oh yes, yes. It is Monsanto. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did you say that the seed farmers dig up the beets after the winter and replant them? Is that how they spin their life cycle?
Oh, so you're asking about stecklings and why they're transplanted and how they're transplanted. So yes, I mean, initially they're grown in nurseries. They're really grown under tight conditions. And then that's just the vegetative stage. So they grow them through the winter. They're initiated to flower, but have not started sending up that flowering stalk. At that point, they are dug up and then planted at a larger field spacing. And then also at that time, it allows for greater inventory control. So they can decide at that time, which crosses they're going to make. So it allows them a little bit greater flexibility. But with the stecklings, yeah, they transplant the roots, and then they grow them until they send up that flowering stalk and produce seed. Yes?
I really appreciated your presentation tonight, and from your undergraduate degree in philosophy, it seems that you spend a lot of time wrestling with legalities and technicalities,
Mm-hmm.
which you know, and the statement here that who owns the intellectual property rights? Of course, Monsanto owns it. And could you maybe just reflect a little bit on the implication of Monsanto, one single company owning the gene pool of most of the crops around the world?
Okay, so you're asking about Monsanto as patent holder and holding the rights to a lot of these crops. Am I a fan of Monsanto? No. Fortunately, I'm really not. I think Monsanto has screwed up in the public relations department. I mean, is that an understatement? So I do believe in capitalism. I do believe that people have, or companies have the right to patent their technologies, and if they are going to invest $100 million in a crop, they have the right to reap the benefits from that. But that said, I don't necessarily agree with the practices that they have engaged in. I think they should have been more transparent. And of course, I mean, there are lots of other situations where I wouldn't say that I agree with Monsanto, so. Yes?
My question may be twofold. I can accept the premise that the sugar between the GM and the conventional is identical sucrose. But I'm wondering if anyone in the process at FDA or USDA managed to evaluate for contamination from the Roundup and or compare that level of chemical contamination with what chemical contamination level is when they use conventional growing and conventional herbicide application.
Now, I'm pretty sure that they did look at residues. Now, it may have been more of a joint project between the FDA and the EPA, because remember, the EPA is responsible for regulating the application of herbicides, but they did look at it and they determined what was an acceptable residue. Now, I don't know what the levels were between Roundup as opposed to the other herbicides, but I do know that those other herbicides tend to be a lot more toxic, and frankly, they're really outmoded herbicides that are being used, and I would suspect they've been grandfathered in because they're the only ones that were available for conventional sugar beets. Yes?
I was still on the judges that are in final say with deregulations and they don't have that scientific background. What are they looking for in their final decisions if they don't know anything scientifically about what's going on with the beets?
Well, I wouldn't say that they know. Okay, so the question is, you have judges that are not conversant in science. What are they looking for in these cases? Well, that was a broad generalization. Of course, there are judges out there that are educated in science, so it was maybe an overly broad generalization. But that said, judges do have help. First of all, they get briefs from both parties, so they are essentially being educated by the parties. Now, of course, they're going to take contradictory positions, but you're going to get bombarded by information. Now, the judge also usually has a legal clerk that can go out and research some of this too. But it eventually is going to fall upon that judge to make that decision. Now, it depends on the individual judge. There are some judges out there that are so afraid of science, they're going to want to hang their hat on a procedural hook. So they're going to they're going to try and decide the case procedurally so they don't have to delve into the science. There are other judges out there that want to get in there and second guess scientific determinations and really grapple with it. So it's really on a case by case basis, judge by judge, court by court. So it really differs. But good question. Yes?
Well, the first discussion you and the first questioner had was about a subject that's so far over my head I can't begin to comprehend it. And I don't want to open a whole new can of worms, or maybe this will be your next visit to OSU will be on that subject, but it sounded like there's new technologies being developed that will allow us to maybe sidestep this whole issue eventually. And what I'm wondering is the idea of following the money. Who's involved in that research? Does Monsanto have a stake in that? And if not, what are the politics? How is Monsanto going to undermine that promising new research?
Okay, so your question is you want me to explain these other technologies that can be competing with genetically modified crops. How are they evading regulation? And what are the politics behind that? Well, I can tell you a little bit about it. In my own lab, I work for the Alan Smith lab at the University of Minnesota, and he used to work with genetically modified crops. He used to be interested in using the male sterility gene on horticultural crops, so that these crops would not become, so that these horticultural plants would not become invasive in the environment. But it's become so expensive to deregulate a crop that the normal scientist at a public institution can't afford to continue along that endeavor. So in my own lab, what we're doing is we're radiating seeds. So we're concerned about the Amur maple. We're concerned that it's going to become invasive in the environment. So what are we doing? We're trying to come up with a sterile plant. instead of just targeting, just taking one gene and transforming it, instead we're irradiating like 10,000 seeds looking for the one that is going to be sterile. So I wouldn't say that that's going to necessarily replace genetic engineering anytime soon. It is a lot more burdensome to do. But people are definitely looking for these other technologies and engaging in these other technologies to escape regulation. And some of these technologies, in my mind, may even be more risky than genetic engineering. I mean, like if you irradiate these seeds, I mean, you're changing more than one gene. You could be changing large portions of the chromosome. So these other technologies have risks, probably even larger risks than genetic modification. So we're moving in that direction to evade regulation. Now, as far as whether Monsanto has their finger in the pie there, probably. I mean, it's a big company. I'm not quite sure what they have in their pipeline, but I don't think they're going to be undermining other people with respect to that technology. Yes?
Close to that same tangent, you mentioned that the herbicides are old technology.
Mm-hmm.
Is anybody working on new technology, or is Monsanto squashed?
No. So is anybody working on new conventional herbicides for sugarbeet? And the answer is no. And it really has nothing to do with Monsanto. These conventional herbicides are being used because there's really no incentive to produce new herbicides. They're very costly to produce, and frankly, when you produce new herbicides now, you get sued. I mean, the regulatory process for approving a new herbicide has become very costly. Now, considering that sugar beets are a relatively small crop, and we're talking about 10,000 farmers across the US, there's really no incentive to produce a new herbicide. So that's why they're stuck with the old conventional herbicides.
I will say to begin with that my partner is Frank Warren, and we do grow those.
Yes.
Table chart that you're referring to. And I think that he would love to have been here, but he is down with the lawsuit assisting the lawyers that are suing Monsanto.
Yes.
And it's most of Monsanto lawyers that are on the other side of the room. I think you would have to take quite a bit of measure with a number of things that you said. I mean, one thing I would like to clarify that is true is that there is zero tolerance for GMO cross-contamination with our seed crops. Any contamination of our seed crop makes it worthless for us as a seed crop. And I think you were talking about a little contamination, but there is none allowable under organic certification.
Well, but isn't organic certification under the NOP, and that's more process-based?
But if our seed is tested and there's any GMO found in any of our seed, it's gone. It's worthless to us. And we can't sell it as organic seed. I'd like to say that, I was talking to him on the phone today from his farm, and one of the things that was very interesting to me in that conversation was talking about court documents filed today in court, and there is demonstrated a great deal of cross-contamination, pollination in conventional crops. There is a court document that refers to that. Only the lead attorney in our case has ever seen the documents because they're under seal, but the court documents indicate that there was and has been quite a bit of contamination, cross-contamination.
With the conventional?
Well, GMO to conventional, not necessarily ours, but GMO to conventional, and they documented that. And I can also say from my own experience that there is in the last year, there was an instance where there was a whole lot of GMO stacklings that ended up in getting spread all over the valley because they got put in some fertile plant mix that got sold to gardeners throughout the Benton County, dumped all over the place, even though the industry said that that was not
We should give Esther a
Yeah.
chance to respond as well, right?
Okay, I will, certainly. I just want to say that the other thing that concerns me is that, that there's a, the resistance to plant resistance, GMO, Roundup Ready crops, and the resistance on weeds to Roundup. My understanding is that it's probably good for about 6 crop cycles, and then you're out of it. And a testimony to that is GMO cotton, which they now cannot, the Roundup Ready GMO cotton,
that's
which is
BT.
no longer useful. I mean, the herbicide Roundup is no longer useful in that crop because so many plants have developed resistance to that, and that coming down the pike instead of Roundup Ready crops is going to be 2,4-D ready crops. The next thing to come down the line, and then after that it's going to be something else coming down the line. So the idea that this is going to be something that you can put in place, this Roundup Ready crop, and it will go on. It's not
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to try. I don't think I can summarize all that, but I might. Let me see here. So we'll go to Roundup Ready resistance. No, I agree that we need to protect against resistance to Roundup. I don't think we should be growing this for 6 successive cycles or 10 successive cycles. I mean, I agree that we need to use good stewardship practices. So, I mean, you and I are probably closer on that point. Now, with respect to your second point, with the stecklings in the compost pile, sure, you had stecklings in the, I think there were some stecklings that were thrown or disposed of, and they were composted, and they were discovered. Now, I might be corrected on this, but it's my understanding that these stecklings were in fact male sterile. And Carol, am I right on this? Were these? Okay. But I mean, there's a possibility that they were in fact male sterile, and in fact they did not flower or spread pollen. Now, should that have happened? No, no. They need better procedures in place. But I mean, some of these things do happen occasionally, but I wouldn't say that there was no real evidence of cross-pollination that occurred as a result of this. These were discovered, fortunately, and then analyzed and then destroyed. But it's my understanding this was an isolated incident.
Just one other comment was about the tolerance levels. And who imposes that, whether it's the organic system of the government or whether it's the markets. Do you want to comment on that? Or?
Yes, I do want to comment on that. Thank you for reminding me about that. It's not the government that's imposing these zero tolerance standards. If you do read the organic standards, they say that as long as you follow the procedures and try and prevent cross contamination or cross pollination, that you can then earn the certification. It's the actual market, the organic market, that has imposed the zero tolerance standard. But it's not all organic markets. It's my understanding that Whole Foods is trying to take the lead on this, and they're creating the the non-GMO project standard, where they're trying to adopt some low-level presence standard. And it would be beneficial to the organic industry, because if they had a little bit of contamination, their crop wouldn't be devalued, and then it would also be beneficial to the farmers growing genetically modified crops.
One last question.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't see you.
I have to object to the describing Roundup Ready Sugarbeet system as sustainable. Glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, there's been a lot of evidence coming out recently showing that it does indeed have a huge effect on the soil and plant health and subsequent human health from eating these plants. It affects the soil community, and it is far from a sustainable product.
Now you're saying that Roundup is not sustainable because it has non-target effects on on soil organisms, probably on members of the aquatic community. And my point is that it's more sustainable than the conventional herbicides that we're using. So if we go back, we're going to be adopting, or we're going to be using conventional herbicides that will be far more deleterious for soil organisms and also for the water, for the aquatic community. So I believe that I'm saying it in comparison to the conventional herbicides, it is more sustainable.
Right, but more sustainable in something that isn't sustainable still.
Well, I mean, I think I would like to take something that has a lesser risk as opposed to something that has more risk, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Mm-hmm.